All right, good evening. Here we go. Last week we took a look at the background, the historical background of Daniel. We looked at the first two verses of chapter 1, and just that background and the two verses were 10 pages of notes. A little bit easier on you tonight, only 7 pages of notes. So we'll see if we can get through that. But this is going to be increasingly harder as the book goes on to get through the chapters in a thorough manner. It's hard for me to just gloss over. I tend to just want to go deep in all those all the time, but we'll see how we do. All right, so this is the first of the court stories. And John pointed, if you heard John's question a few minutes ago, he's like, when did you go back to using stories? I have a little pet peeve of mine that when we talk about events in the Bible or we talk about accounts in the Bible, sometimes we use the word stories, like the story of Jonah and the fish or the story of David and Goliath. It's just my own opinion, but sometimes when you use the word story, it seems to communicate to me that this is just kind of a fable. It's not. This is real stuff. And so I try to use the word account when we talk about those events. But the word court stories is different because it's a genre. It's a type of genre of ancient literature. So court stories were used in other aspects of ancient literature, not just the Bible. So that's why the word stories is there. And this is the first of the court stories told of the exploits of Daniel and the three other Hebrews, the only other Hebrews that we know of, their names in the book of Daniel. So here we go. Let me read verses 3 through 7. We'll start there and look at these main characters. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them, and to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So that's where we have the main characters listed here in verses 3 through 7. Let's just kind of take it verse by verse and walk through it. The king ordered Ashpenaz. The first character we meet, this Ashpenaz, is a proper name in Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of Babylon. So that's, if you're wondering why the book of Daniel was written kind of back and forth in Hebrew and Aramaic, Aramaic was kind of the language of Babylon at that time. This name, Ashpenaz, appears on an artifact of an incantation bowl dating to circa 600 BC. So from around this same time period. So it's a historical, verifiable name. Not saying it's the same person. We can't know that. But at least that name and that time period is consistent. Andrew Hill writes, the name is associated with lodging in some manner and may mean innkeeper. Ashpenaz probably served as a type of chamberlain, overseeing the accommodations or the room and board for the captives, and headmaster in terms of supervising the education of the captive foreign youth and approving them for graduation into the civil service corps upon completion of their prescribed period of training. So he was like a headmaster, just one that the king appointed to put over these, and we'll learn more about these in the next few minutes, more about these captives or exiles that were taken from Judah. And then it says that Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials. The chief of his officials. According to Hill, the title chief of the court officials uses the Akkadian loan phrase. Maybe I should stop there and explain. Akkadian, even more ancient language and an ancient civilization. Akkadian predates even the rise of the first great Babylonian Empire, which was active during the time of the Israelites' captivity in Egypt. So back to that time and even before. Akkadian is a language that a lot of scholars, there's guys that have PhDs in Akkadian, It's almost similar to hieroglyphics. There's pictures that describe the different sentences and inscriptions on different artifacts. So this Akkadian loan phrase in the Hebrew could be chief eunuch. Chief eunuch. If you know what a eunuch is, it was people that were put into service and they were castrated for various reasons. One being so that the king knew that those people wouldn't go after the queen or the princesses or the harems or things like that. That was a way of subjugating them. And but I will say that the text of Daniel does not imply that Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were made eunuchs. Just because this was a chief of the eunuchs doesn't mean that they were made eunuchs. Some scholars or commentators do make that leap. They do make that assumption. One, because we know nothing of Daniel being married, and so some draw that conclusion. But there's nothing in the text to suggest that they were made eunuchs. It would be an assumption. And then it says, some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles. The word family in the Hebrew here is even more specific, because we could say, well, my family's from East Texas. And that could mean your aunts and your uncles and your great-grandfathers and your, things like that. But the word family here in the Hebrew is the word for seed. So it's very specific to be a descendant or an offspring of the royal family. The word for nobles has also been translated in other places as princes. So more about that too in just a bit. Then it says in verse 4, Utes. Anybody? Utes? No? My cousin Vinny? Anybody? All right, some of you. Come on now, catch up. Joe Pesci. All right, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom. All right, so New American Standard and the ESV uses youths as the translation. The King James Version goes so far as to use children. And that's maybe a statement of the time period to which the King James was written in, and what were viewed as children were older then, and I don't know that there was the term youths then, maybe there was. But the vast majority of scholars and translators assert that the ones referred to here were specifically teenagers between the ages of 13 and 17. So, some scholars make Daniel out to be a little bit older. There's not any evidence of that. This is the only way that we have to come of that. We know that he was there 70 years. We know he served to a certain time. But this is the only indication of how old he might have been when he was taken into exile. Many scholars that I've read, for some reason, and I couldn't really get to why they felt so strongly about it, they were really strongly about the age 14 for Daniel. But I don't know that we can know that. But apparently there were 5 criteria that Ashpenaz was commissioned to look for. And by the way, these are not the only 4 that were conscripted for service. These weren't the only 4 out of those that have been taken in the first deportation from Judah. There were as many as 1,000 that could have been taken in this first deportation. But apparently there were 5 criteria that Ashpenaz was to look for. One, first says no defect. No defect. The implication is that there was no physical mark. There was no birthmark. There was no scar. There was no tattoo, if you will, or no imprint of a society or anything like that. Secondly, they were good looking, and that means pretty much what it says. Literally pleasing sight, or what the Hebrew words there say. Now, you might think already this sounds very vain, because we know about the story of David. We know that God looks for the heart, not the outward appearance. This is not God doing this. This is Nebuchadnezzar. It's the Babylonians, a whole different ballgame. They're also looking for intelligence in every branch of wisdom. They were already to have a foundation of a variety of subjects. And then endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge. We don't get the full flavor of the Hebrew here. The King James uses the word science here. The Hebrew implies that much because many commentators refer to the knowledge of science is what's being implied. The basic attribute here could be correlating facts to form conclusions. That type of science, not necessarily how to separate ions or atoms or anything, but correlating facts to form conclusions is what seems to be the intention here. We might think of this as the ability to interpret or predict. And of course, Babylon was famous for the art of cosmology. That's not cosmetology, it's cosmology. In fact, some have drawn the conclusion that the wise men or the magi of Luke chapter 2 that came from the east, the direction of Babylon, were from the school of astrologists trained in the methods that Daniel may have had a hand in creating during his time in Babylon. But that's a whole other lesson that we won't go into. Finally, the last characteristic was an ability for serving in the king's court. And this has to do with poise, manner, social skills that would not embarrass the king, certain amount of understanding of what it takes to be amongst the royals. And I think that goes back to verse 3, some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles. So those are the 5 things that Ashpenaz is looking for in and amongst these 1,000 or so exiles that have been brought in the first deportation.
John, something it has always interested me in this is, Daniel's not going to be the first one of these guys where a foreigner rises to
Right.
authority.
Joseph, yeah.
Joseph's going to do it. Haman.
A
little bit later do that. He's a foreigner. It's interesting to me that foreign kings would incorporate outsiders in their court.
It is.
It'd be similar to the president of the United States decided that he needed a German for a defense minister or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that we'll see this in a minute, but I think it's more about grooming and changing the culture or the identity of those that are conscripted, than it is anything else. So the king, Nebuchadnezzar, ordered him to teach the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Don't be mistaken by Chaldeans, Babylonians, same thing. Mesopotamians, it's all that same region or all that same group there. Now, in addition to what these young men would bring to the table, they had to know all the ways of the people of Babylon, all the history, all the backstory, a citizenship class, if you will. Peter Michalowski writes, "The school was an ideological molder of minds, the place where future members of the bureaucracy were socialized, where they received a common stock of ideas and attitudes which bound them together as a class and in many ways separated them from their original backgrounds." So that's what we just talked about. Andrew Hill adds to that. He said, "The policy of incorporating capable foreign captives in the civil service corps as officials of the king was widespread in the ancient world." So this was not something unique to Babylon. But this was much more than education. And I kind of hinted to that earlier. This was indoctrination. It was reprogramming those that were most capable of influencing others of their own kind. Now, if you think that can actually happen, you don't have to go far back into our history, 80 or 90 years, and you can look at what Adolf Hitler did, doing the exact same thing prior to World War II. I gave you this quote here from an article. "Hitler Youth Boys participated in a number of activities, largely focused on sports and physical development, such as boxing and camping trips. They also received intense instruction in Nazi ideology and anti-Semitism, military training like shooting, and enveloped a strong commitment to Hitler. Young girls were trained in household chores, such as making beds and cooking, as well as nursing and charitable work. Nazi involvement in children's lives was so prevalent, they had no time for activities outside of school and their youth organizations. During summers, Hitler Youth were sent to work on farms and simultaneously participated in Nazi ideological work by teaching German to immigrants who had settled in Germany and guarding camps that held Polish teens." He was doing the same thing, for a little bit different reason. Maybe not much of a different reason, but another part of that article that I didn't copy for you said that, Hitler was very strategic in indoctrination. He had a whole section of his Mein Kampf that had to do with how you win over people's minds, how you create a frenzy and create a whole different mindset and change a culture. He was very intentional in those things. So that's really what Nebuchadnezzar is doing here. He's trying to take this group of captives here, and he's trying to see who amongst them can be most useful to him in not only in the Babylonian culture, but in the culture of those that are exiled, so that he can make of them eventually more Babylonians, right? Because it was not under the Babylonians that the Jews were able to go back to Judea. It was under Cyrus later on. So and we see that the Assyrians did the same thing with the northern kingdom, and that's why that northern kingdom, those 10 tribes, are considered lost, because they integrated and mingled into the culture of the Assyrians, right? So they were, verse 5, a daily ration. The king appointed them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank. Now the words choice food here shed some light on the response that we'll see from Daniel and the three boys. The words here are Persian loan words. So just like the Akkadian loan word, this is a Persian loan word that means a provision of meat. So king's choice food wasn't the salad bar; it was meat. That's what, and that was the problem. And we'll get to that in a minute. And now they were also to be educated for 3 years, a 3-year program. The word educated means a child's growing up. In Hebrew, it meant to make great. Included more than just learning. It was behavior modification, it was character building, it was all of those things. Donald Wiseman points out the schools of King Nebuchadnezzar's day would have continued to literally copy, sign lists, that's Akkadian, word lists, paradigms, extracts of legal terminology, religious documents of all kinds, fables and omens of various categories, including those about devils and evil spirits, as well as texts of possible historical interests. MacArthur adds this. He said, further, the Chaldeans had knowledge of astronomy and astrology. They had a sophisticated mathematical system involving a sexagesimal system of numeration. That's 60, I had to look it up. They had a certain amount of natural history. They had a huge store of mythological learning, including legends of the creation and the flood. Let me stop there. A lot of cultures in the world have a flood and creation story. You'll find a lot of them are similar to what the Bible has. And so it's easy, it's not a leap to see how the Bible's story of truth, I believe, mingled into other cultures, and they adapted, so not really wanting to embrace the Bible, but to make their own that had enough semblance of familiarity to create their own mythology. Let's see. They had likewise a tremendous plurality and plethora of gods, a whole pantheon of deities. We talked about that last week. They had a tremendous knowledge of agriculture. They were perhaps the finest architects in the whole world, and as many of the celebrated buildings of Babylon show, you might be interested to know that in the building of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and in the building of the palaces, they had sophisticated air conditioning systems at the time, which they had developed. I don't know what any more than that, but I'll take MacArthur's word for that. But according to most scholars, Daniel and his friends, whether even from their nobility, even would have come knowing some of this, but along the way would have learned Hebrew, Aramaic, Persian, and Akkadian more than likely. I read something earlier that said Cleopatra was one of the most learned of all the ancient rulers. She had this amazing capacity to learn and knew multiple languages. So that would have been a part of kind of royal culture at that time. Akkadian would have been the ancient language of the first great Babylonian Empire. I mentioned that during the time of the Egyptian captivity. All right, verse 6. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Verses 6 and 7 point out that these young men that were exiles were also given names that reflected their new environment. And they were initially, as one writer put it, diplomatic hostages. And so I gave you that chart again. That was from last week where we looked at those names there. I won't go over those again. But I want to point out something that I think will become evident as we walk through Daniel. You'll notice that every trace of Yahweh, the God of the Bible, was removed from these 4 young men. In every way, shape, or form, the Babylonians tried to shield them from their heritage, shield them from their theology. And I think we'll see that even though their names were changed, the Babylonians could not change their hearts. And I think that'll be an example to us. Now, before we move on, I want to point out, I ran across these 2 passages of Scripture that may shed a little bit more light. I don't want to make too much of it, but the first passage from 2 Kings is the retelling, the history portion of that deportation under King Jehoiakim at this time. It's in 2 Kings 24. It says, "He, the king of Babylon," that's Nebuchadnezzar, "carried out from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon king of Israel had made in the temple of the Lord, just as the Lord had said. Then he led away into exile all Jerusalem, all the captains, all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. So he led Jehoiakim away into exile to Babylon, and also the king's mother and the king's wives, his officials, and the leading men of the land. He led away into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. All the men of valor, 7,000, and the craftsmen and smiths, 1,000, all strong and fit for war. And these the king of Babylon brought into exile to Babylon." So this is just a little more backstory on what took place as the pages of Daniel begin. But look at Isaiah 39. I found this one interesting. This is, again, 100 years before or so. This is under King Hezekiah. And Isaiah is prophesying to Hezekiah. And he says this in verse 5. Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house, all that is in your fathers have laid up in store to this day, will be carried to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your sons who will issue from you, whom you will beget, will be taken away, and they will become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon." I don't know who else that could be but Daniel, right? Gabriel.
You think it's safe to say that the Ark of the Covenant got taken away and the people went gold and
Yeah, I think so.
we're wasting our time looking for it?
Yeah, I think so. There was definitely no ark in the first century temple that Herod built. There was no ark. The Holy of Holies was barren. All the Jews in their time of the first century were worshiping a broken system. There was no sacrifices that were being sprinkled onto the mercy seat. It wasn't there. And so, yeah, I think so, but that's just my opinion. There's a whole lot of different theories, and Indiana looked for it, and supposedly found it. Some people say it's still being guarded by somewhere in a cave. Some people say it's even in a part of Africa. I don't know. I think it was destroyed like. Oh, it's in a government. Daryl knows it's in a government warehouse. Yeah. Good question. Trimper Longman. Trimper wrote the NIV application commentary on Daniel, and he says rabbinic tradition associates Daniel 1:3, where it's talking about those sons of Israel, with Isaiah 39:7, and asserts that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were descendants of King Hezekiah. Now, that's rabbinic tradition. Again, we can't bank on that. There's a lot of rabbinic tradition that sounds crazy. But the passage from 2 Kings and the passage from Isaiah are pretty strong evidence. Anyway, that was just kind of a lanyard. Okay, let's look at the next section, verses 8 through 16, which we see as the plot. The plot. Verse 8, "But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink, for why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths of your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. Thought just now occurred to me, and I didn't put it in the notes as I read it, but why was Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah the only ones who had this thought? There were undoubtedly other Hebrews that were there. They didn't see, it doesn't indicate that they balked at eating the king's choice food. There were probably, I would imagine, not only Hebrews there in that training program, but there were other nations, other people from other cultures that Babylonia had kind of swooped up and conquered along the way. But there had to have been a great number of Hebrews there, but yet it doesn't indicate that anybody but these four made a stand to say, we're not going to partake of that. I don't know what we draw from that. It was just a thought that flew into my head. Now, verse 8, but Daniel made up his mind. If you're one who doesn't mind marking in your Bible, highlight it, underline that in your Bible, or put a star by these words. Literally, the words in Hebrew are that Daniel set upon his heart. Set upon his heart. Remember, this is a teenager. That's the amazing thing. This is a teenager. Some say as young as 14, who knew God well enough to make up his mind not to defile himself. And can I just say to you, as parents in the room, and for all of us really, but particularly parents as you're raising your children, it's important that we make up our minds to obey before the moment of temptation comes. In the moment is not the time to think, maybe I should be strong here. No, you must be resolute before those moments come, right? And so Daniel apparently had that resolve in him to make up his mind, or to set his heart upon being obedient to the Lord. Now, there's some other things in this. I didn't put this in the notes either, but the question could be asked: well, why didn't they revolt on everything? Because here they are learning Babylonian theology about all this pantheon of different gods and trying to learn all these different cultural things. That surely can't have been good for them. The answer is there was no biblical admonition not to learn. But there was biblical admonition about the choice food and wine. And we'll see that in just a minute.
Probably pork.
Probably. Yeah, I would imagine. But there's two issues at play that we'll get to. But that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or the wine. Why would the choice food or the provision of meat of the king cause Daniel to defile himself? Two reasons. One, it could have been a meat that was not permitted of the Hebrew people. For example, like John said, pork. I gave you Leviticus 11, 1 through 6. The Lord spoke again to Moses and to Aaron, saying to them, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, these are the creatures which you may eat from all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever divides a hoof, thus making split hoofs, and chews the cud among the animals, that you may eat. I had a burger at Culver's today. It was okay that I ate that. Nevertheless, you are not to eat of these among those which chew the cud, or among those which divide the hoof. The camel, can't imagine camel being good. Camel, for though it chews the cud, it does not divide the hoof. It is unclean to you. Likewise, the shafan, that's a rock badger. Never seen one of those, but for though it chews cud, it does not divide the hoof. It is unclean to you. The rabbit also, for though it chews cud, it does not divide the hoof. It's unclean to you. So there are all these restrictions and all these laws. If you think Leviticus is bad, you should read the 366 laws that were set up by the priests and Pharisees later on. Unbelievable ridiculousness in some of the laws. So that's one reason. It could have been, like John said, pork or something that was unclean to the Jews. Or two, it could have been meat that was first offered to an idol. Now, there's not a really specific I gave you Leviticus 17. Let me just read that. Any man from the house of Israel who slaughters an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or who slaughters it outside the camp and has not brought it to the doorway of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, blood guiltiness is to be reckoned to that man. He has shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people. That's not necessarily an admonition to say, don't eat meat offered to idols. It is an admonition to say everything that you eat is from the Lord. That was really the admonition of Leviticus 17. The New Testament makes it abundantly clear. Paul makes it clear in 1 Corinthians 8. You are not to eat meat sacrificed to idols. So I think it was both of these reasons that why Daniel refused to eat of the king's choice food. Now, it may not have been the only two reasons, but I think those are two good enough reasons for him to do this. So then he sought permission from the commander. Permission's an added word there in your translation. It's not in the Hebrew. So he sought audience or sought a talk with the commander of the officials. Most scholars seem to think that this commander is Ashpenaz. I think it's a different person. Does it matter? No, it really doesn't, but you know how I am. I think it's a different person in a different position from Ashpenaz. Why do I think so? Ashpenaz was named in verse 3 as the chief of his officials, and this was one of the officials that was under, I think this was one of the officials under Ashpenaz, because verse 3 uses the word chief, or in the Hebrew, Rav, of his officials. Verse 8 uses the word commander, which is Sar in the Hebrew of the officials. So two different Hebrew words there. I think that's enough to say I think there were two different positions. But again, it doesn't matter.
Could there also be different offices?
Yes, absolutely. There could be different offices. And you see, my OCD and my thinking on this is you can have pity for Jenny having to live with me on all this. But verse 9, now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. I gave you the NIV translation, which I think is actually a little bit better. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. See the difference in that? The New American Standard and the ESV are a little bit more subtle, but still the sense of the Hebrew in the text is God's action upon this official. And we see this kind of language several places in chapter 1. We already saw it in verse 2 that the Lord gave Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. We see it here in verse 9, and we see it again in verse 17. God gave them knowledge and intelligence. So it's again, all underscore that theme of Daniel, that God is the one who is moving history along. God is the one who is acting upon history. Okay, verse 10. Then the commander of the officials said to Daniel, he admits his fear of the king here. He tells Daniel that he's asking for something which could cause him to be beheaded. That's another reason why I think it's somebody besides Ashpenaz. I don't think that Ashpenaz would be that susceptible to beheading that quickly, but I could be wrong. Now, in verses 11 through 16, we've already read them, but I'll say Daniel seems to go to yet a different official, even now what I believe is a third different person. And he's called in verse 11 the overseer. Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So I think a third, at least a second different person here that Daniel appeals to. The King James Version gives us the name Meltzar, and whether that's the name of the official or the title, we don't really know. And this, I give you verse 11 in the King James. Then said Daniel to Meltzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. So Daniel asked the overseer for vegetables and water. Ugh, he must have been really, really wanting to be obedient. Can't imagine. Instead of the meat and wine, for a 10-day period. And he could see for himself if the diets make any difference. Overseer agrees, and after 10 days, they look even more fit and fatter. Amen. Fatter. Which really means healthy and fortunate. It doesn't mean overweight. Yet again, foiled. Trimper Longman, he writes this. He says, Daniel and his three friends are in a process of education and preparation for service. Their minds as well as their bodies are being fed by the Babylonian court. If they prosper, then to whom should they attribute their development and success? The Babylonians. Do you see his point there? If they're going along with the program and at lock, stock, and barrel and everything, their success could only be attributed to the Babylonian process. And he says, however, by refusing to attribute their refusing to eat the food of the king, they know it's not the king who's responsible for the fact that they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Their robust appearance, robust, I like that word. I feel like I'm robust. Usually attained by a rich fare of meats and wine, is miraculously achieved through a diet of vegetables. Only God could have done that. You see the difference there? And here's another point about it. I didn't put it in the notes, but as far as we know, they told no one. It was Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and that overseer, and then Ashpenaz and the other guy knew about their desire to do it, but nobody else knew. They didn't announce it. They didn't make a big deal of it. That's interesting to me. Okay, last section. How are we doing? We're good. 45 minutes in. Verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Okay, there's a couple things that occurred to me. I hope I remember them. But verse 17, God gave them. We already pointed out, God gave. Whether or not we see this as a blessing because of their faithfulness or just preparation from what they will yet face, God is the one who provided the enabling power to them. It says Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. We'll definitely see how this plays out, how it's beneficial to Daniel throughout the rest of the book. Even as early as chapter 2 next week, we'll see that. And one of the things that occurred to me as I read it, if you think that a follower of Jesus, or we'll say a follower of Yahweh at this point, understanding and being able to interpret visions and dreams is only Old Testament stuff, then you're not aware of the culture in Middle Eastern countries today. There are Middle Eastern peoples of all the different regions there, and Sarah's been there and lived there recently. Steve and Louise have lived there. That God communicates to them through visions. God is giving them visions of Christ, of the risen Christ. God is giving, I believe, missionaries and believers an ability to know instinctively how to talk with them about those things. I think that is the activity of God amongst a people of that land where they are uniquely bent toward that. Bent may not be the right word. Susan?
In a course that I took some years ago, they were talking about how to reach people for Christ from that area, and they said the number one thing you can do is pray that God would reveal himself to them through their visions and dreams.
Yeah. Well, if you didn't, for the sake of the recording, what Susan said was she took a course a while back that said the number one thing that you can do to reach people of that region is to pray that they would be open to, and God would reveal himself to them in dreams and visions.
Yeah,
Richard?
The perspectives class that was here.
Oh, yeah, perspectives.
And
Yeah, for sure.
missionaries from around the world would come here and share how just people of the land would have dreams and visions, and they would work off of that to actually bring them to Christ.
Absolutely. Larry?
Just today, I saw a news blurb that 200 Muslim soldiers had dreams of Christ in the last few days.
Wow.
And accepted him.
Wow.
This was over in in this mess that's going on.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Yeah, even today, Larry said he saw a news blurb that 200 soldiers had a vision of Christ and were converted. Okay. Verse 18, at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them. Daniel 1:5 told us that the period was 3 years. Okay, 3 years. We're gonna run into I'm just gonna tell you, we're gonna run into a problem in chapter 2 of timing, but it'll be explained. But if you've read ahead, or if you read the first verse of chapter 2, you're already seeing, wait a minute, something's wrong with the timeline. It's not, but just pointing that out. Okay, just to tease next week, I guess. The commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. This would have been a very formal and probably very intimidating, scary process for these teenagers that had gone through this education. Scholars say that there could have been as many as 75 that went through the process out of the 1,000 that were deported, or even thousands that were brought to first deportation. Verse 19, Daniel and his friends rose above all that were brought before the king. And in verse 20, it seems as though it was indeed a rigorous interrogation by Nebuchadnezzar, but the 4 young men were found 10 times better than even the ones who were already in service to the king. All right, now it's interesting that he says better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all of his realm. Babylon was a big realm at that time. They were swallowing up countries and taking land and areas, but he had these magicians and conjurers. And I don't remember if I said it last week, but if so, I'll say it again, that under the power of these false gods that the Babylonians worshipped, there were legitimate powers of these gods that were given, and these gods had power, but I will say not anywhere near the power of Yahweh, because Yahweh is like no other God. By the way, so many things in my head that I got to get out. When the Bible says there is no one like you, there's no God like you, we tend to just gloss over that and think, wow, he's just alone in the world as the greatest. No, he's not alone in the cosmos. He is above everything else in the cosmos, implying that there are other gods, and there's none like him. Nobody else can compare to him. Okay, but
We could say they're fallen angels or demons.
yes. Mm-hmm. People that, fallen angels, or we'll say beings, maybe a better word to put it, that he gave dominion. He gave them dominion. He gave them a certain degree of authority and set them. They're more like territorial deities. Put it that way. Could something like that. Okay, so that was one of the things. And so then these magicians and conjurers, they had power. You don't need to look any further than Exodus to know that Pharaoh's magicians had power, right? They were able to do a few things, and Moses was going spar for spar with them. So they had powers. They just weren't powers for Yahweh, for God. Okay. I think I just said that. So, of course, we must remember that while these magicians, conjurers probably had some kind of power, no amount of ability of that kind could compare the wisdom and power of the one true God, Yahweh. Wendy Witter, she writes this, Nebuchadnezzar may have sought to extinguish the very remembrance of God, but that same God is the triumphant one in this opening chapter. Furthermore, that same God will bless the foreign king through the presence of his faithful servants in the Babylonian court. God's people may be trapped in an idolatrous foreign land, but he was right there with them. And through his divine presence, God blessed his people, and through them he blessed their captors. The defeated God of Israel was alive and well during the captivity of his people, working as he so often does behind the scenes through the weak and powerless. Now, verse 21 seems to be a little bit of an addendum, or just a little kind of timeline note, but it says Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. I mentioned there was a timeline problem in chapter 2. Well, there's a timeline problem right here too, but I think we'll work through this. It appears to be a confusing chronological note. We know from Daniel 10:1, and I'm not sure if I pointed that out last week, but let me just read it for you real quickly. Daniel 10:1, that says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel. Right? We looked at this in the chronology last week. Daniel 10:1 indicates the 3rd year of Cyrus, that Daniel was still on the scene. But here in chapter 1, verse 21, Daniel continued until the 1st year of Cyrus. So how's that compatible? How do we reconcile that?
Did you say there were 2 different formulations?
Yes, ascension years, yeah. So the ascension year would be He comes to power in the middle of a year, and his actual first year starts the next calendar year, the next January, if you will. But that still didn't reconcile three. That might get us by if there were 2 years, or something. But 3 years is even different. The resolution may be that while Daniel was still in Babylon at that time, he was not at that time serving in the royal court. Thus, he continued or lived until the first year of Cyrus. Yes, or maybe even continued in the court until the first year of Cyrus. But remember, Cyrus was the one who gave the decree that the Jews could begin to return to Judea. So I think it's fair to say that Daniel may have been in Babylon at that time, but not serving in the king's court, at least maybe was given freedom. So that's how I think we reconcile that. I don't think it's an error, if you will. David?
Yep. I think you just read that, so, he served the Babylonian kings until there was no Babylonian king, and then, when the new king, he's out, then he gets this revelation and he gets back in.
Yeah.
It's not difficult.
It's not, or you could read it as just the Daniel's, or the, if we really believe Daniel did it or someone else, that it's just trying to say that he lasted until a new nation took over, under a new king. Could be just as simple as that. Okay, other questions, comments, concerns? We did it before 7:30. Yay. All right.